Hello, sinners. This is Teresa Wallace. Welcome to Sin on the Go. This is part 2 of my conversation with Amelia Behrens. We are talking about shifting mental models. We're going to jump right in where I cut us off the last time. Enjoy. All right, we've talked about this a lot already, but specifically talking about strength-based versus deficit-based language. So let's do some definitions just for super clarity. What is deficit-based language?
Deficit-based language is the words we use to describe what a student cannot yet do. We are viewing them and using words to describe them through their inadequacy, through their shortcomings, basically. And that, like we referenced before, comes from the way that we set kids up in special education. What can this kid not do? How are they not achieving at the same rate as their peers? And then from a strengths-based language approach, strength-based language reframes those challenges as opportunities for students to learn, develop, foster a sense of empowerment or agency. So that strengths-based language is really a rewording to say what can this student do and what could they do or what do they need to develop.
So the deficit-based makes the student the problem.
Absolutely.
Really internalizes that to all of these things are wrapped up in this person who is a problem. Ultimately, and even though you can parse that out into it's this thing and it's this skill and it's X, Y, and Z, really it's centered in this human who exists and who will internalize how you're saying that language.
Definitely.
And if you flip that into a strength-based model, you are empowering that person.
A strengths-based language approach maybe names a student's abilities, their preferences, their access needs, maybe the context of the situation. So I need more support when these circumstances arise. It keeps challenges visible without letting them define the student. And that's a big piece for me because, like you said, we are not setting this student up to say that you are a problem and your skills are limited and you are inherently bad. It's that, here's the circumstances, here's where you're at, and here's the things we can do to support you or how you learn best.
And strength-based doesn't mean you're ignoring a need. It doesn't mean you're ignoring anything that you're trying to support or target as a part of an IEP or as a part of what we're doing for the student and teaching the student.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so we got some examples, some things that we hear all the time, things that I hear and things that I still trip up with, let's be clear. So this is not chucking anyone under the bus if it's not chucking myself. So
absolutely.
Let's just say that.
And I love that education is a world that is in constant state of improvement. It makes it difficult as educators to keep up because there's always a new initiative. At the same time, we are better than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and that's a big deal. And so we've mentioned before that low functioning versus high functioning, maybe reframe that based on where does the student need support? The student needs more support during independent living tasks, or the student needs more support during literacy. Name it as where do we need the support and what does that support look like? Because what might be my version of high versus low might be totally different than yours, especially as we come from different educational settings.
Yep. What about non-compliance?
Oh, absolutely. That's one that I think the neurodiverse community has really tried to call out, is that emphasis on compliance, thinking about how we can include more voice. And I would say when things are language heavy or unpredictable for a student, they may experience challenges. They thrive in environments or with tasks that are closed end or that are highly structured and predictable, or whatever the case may be. And
with visual supports, clear task analysis, clear entry point, end point, like you said, potentially less verbal direction, less repeated verbal direct, you know what I mean? All of those entry points as well.
Well, and it's going to give me more information. So if I'm reading a student's IEP or their progress report, or I'm getting a student from a different district, or they moved in, and I see words like non-compliant, that doesn't give me much information at all. It just says, this is a bad kid. And instead of seeing them as, what do I need to set up? What does this kid need? How do I support this student to be included in my classroom, complete their work, make growth? And that's a big deal.
Yep. I think noncompliance doesn't tell me how to support that kid. It just tells me that they were a problem for wherever they were.
Exactly.
And I think that that's my stereotype when I think about how they were engaging in that building, right? Mental model for me, right? And that is without engaging with that team. And I think for a lot of reasons, I then have a lot of questions, right? What did it look like? What did the supports look like? Like all
Did
the
anybody
things.
like
Tell me
this
all
student?
the things. Like,
Absolutely.
how are we engaging? How did they prepare? Where were they? What did all the things. Like,
Yep.
So I just, that leads me to a lot of questions and then a problem solving. How did they work to solve that? Or was it just they're not doing what they're told? And therefore end. Because if you think that's the end, then we're going to have a problem because you're not engaging in a way that is curious, that is problem solving in a manner that's including the student or that's trying to gain like momentum and thought and thinking that it is a fixed problem. It is potentially not a fixed problem if you have a different entry point or a different perspective or a mental model that says that this can shift.
And it removes ours and our students' sense of agency. So like you said, is it inviting us to a place where we can solve this problem? And maybe I don't have the brain that has the answer. I can find it though. Or is it inviting us to blame that student, blame that family, blame the circumstances, which makes an endpoint. Exactly.
Right? Like none of those things are reasonable or helpful in that moment. Any of them are just leading to inaction and blame.
Exactly.
As opposed to collaborative problem solving, gaining all of the voice and saying, okay, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? Let's do it. And gaining support and gaining potential options to reframe.
And a great way to do that, to invite more problem solving or try to start to shift your mental model and reframe your language, is to, like we mentioned before, get that student's input. And that means you might have to do it over time. You might have to build a relationship with that student. You might have to get to know them on a deep level. I had a wonderful apprentice interaction the other day where a student walked into this classroom and started talking about all of their sports that they were involved in with this apprentice. And this apprentice knew exactly what the student was talking about. And it led to basically a 5-minute conversation as the student got settled of what they were doing around the sport, how it was going, all the aspects of how it's impacting their life and their sleep and all of these pieces. And they had this brief 5-minute interaction of something the student was interested in. The apprentice was very vested in how that student was doing, and that student felt seen, heard, and valued. Mm-hmm. And that's how we build relationships. It's action. It's getting to know students, asking them questions, remembering what's important to them. And we can do that with families as well. We can get to know their family as much as they want us to be involved in their lives. And we can help understand and have context for their culture, their race, their practices, their beliefs. And that can really help us reframe our language. But I would say that's definitely the foundation of beginning this process.
All right, so you pivot us right into that last section, which is, all right, where do we start, right? So we've got all of these things. We've got mental models. We understand what it is. We talked about all of these pieces. But really, I've got a classroom full of humans, and now I don't know where to start. So what does that look like? What do you pick first?
I would pick getting to know students by having conversations with them, but starting with, what are they strong at? What are they good at? What skills do they have? What interests do they have? Getting to know more than just what's their favorite television character or what's their favorite song. There's more to that. Okay, mm-hmm. So you like this particular singer. Maybe you like other music. Maybe you like to listen to it in certain areas. Maybe you like the same song over and over again. But how does that student feel successful? What are they interested in? What are their strengths? And then I'm going to ask more questions of how does that student communicate, because we know behavior is communication. And so in special education, our students are communicating in all sorts of different ways. How do they communicate their emotions, their needs, their goals, their experiences? And then we might have to ask ourselves, what's missing? And we might have to say, what are those lagging skills? What are those unmet problems? And we're still framing them through that strengths-based language approach of what have they already learned and what are they about to learn.
We do love Ross Green. We quote him a lot on this pod. All right, so if we're talking about that, you get to know your students, you get to know their families, and not just surface level things, right? Like go a little deeper. And you can't do any of that if you aren't reflecting and trying to be aware. Do you have a partner? Like, what does this look like?
So beginning this process, I think, is a tough one for me because as people who are in education, but also we have outside lives, right? We are busy humans and we are in a go-go society. And so it's difficult to stop and notice that something has to change in your brain. And so the first step is awareness. This is happening. Notice and recognize that the language you use has an impact. When you are aware of it, when you name it, then it has power. And we have to acknowledge that it's ours to own. And I think that that's the next step is like, this is something that I have power to change. And then we have to commit. I am going to shift my behavior, shift my language, reframe my mental models. I'm going to do something different. And then we can go from there. But all of that happens in the thought process. Maybe you are the person who stays up late at night and ponders these things before going to bed. Maybe
are we those people, Amelia?
Maybe that's us.
Maybe.
Yep. But other times, commutes can be great for this reflection. And some people need thought partners. So inviting others into this process can help you actually be aware of it, acknowledge it, and then shift to change.
If you are in an evaluation year, or if you have a supervisor who comes into your classroom, like I just think about all of the ways, all the places that we use language, an IEP meeting, a classroom instruction, classroom culture, classroom meetings, like how all of the spaces that oh my God, the lunchroom, like all of the places that we talk about, it is a scary place, especially in buildings that are such different cultures and different spaces. Like, how do we talk about students? How do we talk about their families? How do we talk about each other? How do we talk about each other's classrooms? Like, there are so many layers of what this looks like. And because I'm an administrator, I could tackle that differently than someone who is a classroom teacher, right? So knowing your scope, knowing your global impact and where that is means you could tackle this differently. But a paraprofessional has the power to impact all of these other layers, right? So where are you and what can you impact? And it starts with being aware of it and being willing to like make a list. Where are you with your language? What are the things that you think could change? What's the power in that? We've had entire programs years ago shift from calling students to calling them scholars. And there's whole research behind that.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about the academic side. It's a mental frame that we want students to come in and see themselves as students and as scholars who can achieve.
Right.
And these are students in a Fed 4 special education setting who have historically not been successful in school. So there's a lot of reasons why that's powerful. And it took a while to get people on board with that mental model for these students. And now it is embedded in the culture of the spaces. Right? So I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can engage as an entry point, depending on what your role is and where you want to start. And one of those ways is you could listen to the podcast together as a team. Pause it. Think about make a list of all the words that you use as a team or you as a person. Like, how do you engage? Right?
And I think that maintenance piece is also really challenging. So this requires a slowdown and noticing. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing I am bad at, it is slowing down. I am going 100 miles an hour at all times, and that's a reflection of myself. But I need to take a moment, right? It takes time to be in that self-monitoring place. I think it also comes from reflection. So you had an interaction, you used a word. Did your red flag in your brain go off? Did, somebody else kind of slightly recoil when you said something a certain way? Mm-hmm. How did that person walk away from your interaction? What did I learn from that interaction? And then, develop maybe some scripts for yourself. The tools we use with students are the tools we should use with ourselves. So I'm a back pocket phrase person where I'm going to keep something in my pocket to be able to pull out as those go-to phrases or sentences that are going to make it easier for me to shift in the moment. Also, I love using AI for these types of situations. And it's a great way to use AI as a thought partner or your second brain, not your first brain. So I want to say this. How do I say this using strengths-based language? And it can help you rephrase that. And then seeking out more information. Google is everybody's best friend, right? Explore resources and trainings that are going to help you maintain this growth mindset and reframing of language that you want to.
Yeah, that next layer of like how to help others with this is one that you have to be willing to tell people that you're doing this, right?
Yeah.
Which is also an important step in naming it as something that you're working on. If you're a leader of a classroom or a building, like it has to be an explicit goal that you have told people about at whatever layer, because then the work becomes important, it becomes named, it becomes something that people can engage with you on, can talk to you about in whatever role you are in. So if you are not the leader of a building who has named this as a target for your whole building to be working on, and that's not your scope of power or impact, then you could be personally working on this and saying that to whomever your people are. But in order to be helping others out, you have to be willing to talk about it, right? In whatever frame or space that makes sense, right? So if you're just going to be working on it internally, which is not a bad place to start, you can't help others until you are willing to kind of talk about it in a way that feels appropriate.
Yep, the same way that when we name goals that we have for ourselves outside of the world of education, we're at home. I want to get better at meal prepping, for example. If I say it out loud, then other people can help me maintain my goal. And then they're also able to help me through the process, right? Can they role play and practice with me? That would be great. I want to say this, or I'm about to go into an IEP and I'm really practicing using strengths-based language. I have to describe this student's literacy skills, and here's what I have so far. Let's run through it together. An accountability buddy. We had Megan Halverson on the podcast, and she truly is a great accountability buddy for me specifically, to say, hey, I'm working on this word. I want to reduce the use of this word, and I want to shift towards this word.
Yep.
Or I would like to really focus on talking about this piece of a student in a more strengths-based way. How do we get feedback? How do we get encouragement or gentle reminders? That person who's that safe person for you can really do that for you. And listen to students and families, right? What are they saying? How do they want to be spoken about? What's their lived experience, so that we can then represent that in the words that we're choosing.
Yep. I think when you get to that stage and you have people that you're working with that on, and in whatever way that looks like, which can be really exciting and also terrifying, that next stage of interrupting and reframing is a really cool one, right? Where our team, like you talked about, is in a space where we can call each other out in a really positive and proactive way. Like, ooh, that's not a great way to frame that. Are you aware you're doing that, right? Or like maybe a better way to phrase that is this one. And with our team being as tight-knit as we are, because we work together all the time on these really intensive projects, you get a lot of repetition in learning how to do the vernacular. So I think we're not protecting ourselves as much with each other in those spaces, and you can feel a little bit vulnerable sometimes in a way that is also safe with our team members. That's the goal. It doesn't always feel safe when you're like, whoo, that feels like a live wire moment, right? But ultimately, when I get called out for saying something, I still feel protected and like, oh, I'm really glad I said that with you and not in another public space where like, ooh, that's me modeling that for a whole group of people that I'm going to run professional development for.
Yep.
And then they're going to say it because I said it. That's horrible. You got to know your impact. My impact, because of this podcast, because of the professional development, is a lot bigger. And I want to be called out by my team in a safe space, because that's what that looks like for me, right? I'd much rather have that.
So you're showing up the way you want to be. How do you want to be perceived? How do you want to be remembered? And when you are a person who can practice doing that interruption with other people, maybe first with that accountability buddy and then with your safe team, then you're able to practice asking questions, having that curiosity and leading with inquiry to say, you know, I'm not trying to shame you right now, but I'm wondering about, or tell me more. is a great kind of lead. Tell me more about
for a whole host of things.
Yep.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yep.
Tell
and then
me more.
that person maybe can give you more details, or they're going to spell out the circumstances that something's taking place, and they're not then overly simplifying it or putting it in a box using maybe more deficit-based language.
And you don't put yourself in a position of verbalizing maybe some of the assumptions that you might be mentally making.
Yep.
But you're not verbalizing them so that you can accept whatever the actual constructs are that they're going to tell you more about.
Exactly.
So that's really helpful.
It is. And then it leads to that trust being built between the two people having that interaction. I also think it's really helpful. So if someone describes something to me, I might rephrase it and share it right back with them and say, oh, it sounds like you're saying, or I hear you naming that it's important for this student to develop executive functioning skills. Is what you're saying that you want this student to improve, whatever the case may be? And so you can kind of pivot back using the language that you are hoping that that person starts to use, and it gives a great model.
I think the piece about this that's really important is we're not policing each other. Like we're not like, ooh, gotcha. It's not a gotcha moment. It's an awareness. Like and once you're more and more aware of it, those moments will like make your hair stand on end a little bit. You're like, ooh, like that word, like if someone uses, and again, forgive the phrase, but like mental retardation or retard, which used to be a category of service in special education, those words get me all sorts of flared up, right? That language is one that is not in my mental frame or in my vernacular anymore because it means a lot of things in societal norms that are no longer something that I am willing to use or engage with students or families. That is not language that I want to hear us ever using, right? So if I hear it in a space, I'm going to be curious and be really attentive to that language in a way that's like, ooh, I'm going to say something. So I want to bring awareness to that. Does that make sense?
Yep. And it might mean pausing, right? A nice, generous pause might invite that person to reflect that you don't necessarily validate everything they're saying.
Yeah.
And you can paraphrase. You can rename, you can restate, and go back to that strengths-based language. In a trusted group of people, you can always use humor. Whoa, Teresa, what you just said there was not for me. Can you try that again? We have that because we've worked together for so long. And when you can use humor, it makes that sense of being called out a little lower stakes. And so it's helpful to have, like we said, the accountability buddy or that trusted team. But there's lots of ways to be able to interrupt in a safe way that helps that person build the skills you're hoping that they build.
That's me deep breathing. We've gotten really deep on the last couple of episodes here, and I love it. It's the work that needs to be done. It's really important, these topics, because if we are working with these mental mindsets and these topics that we are so passionate about, the impact is massive, right? I mean, teams and classrooms and leaders who can shift whole buildings for students. I mean, just thinking about that makes me so excited. So
for sure.
In closing, because for the love of Pete, this podcast is going, we could talk about mental mindsets for like 7 hours.
We really could.
It's a very worthy topic, but we talked about a lot of very important pieces to this, how words have shaped us in why we engage the way that we do and how we use language the way that we do, and why that's important to be aware of. The impact, you got to know how it's impacting you. You got to think about how it has impacted you as a person, how that then impacts students, and think about what that looks like currently in your spaces. And does it need to change? Think about all of those pieces. How does that make your students feel? We talked a lot about those pieces. We spent a lot of worthy time talking about strength and deficit-based language, and a lot of time talking about how to reframe language, what those steps are. There's a lot more to unpack there. All right. That is the end of part 2 of our Shifting Mental Models podcast episode with Amelia Behrens. I hope that you enjoyed the expanded version of this conversation as much as I did talking to her. So, as we always do, we're going to end with a reflection question. We spent a lot of time in this second part of the podcast talking about strengths and deficit-based language. So, what we wanted you to reflect on was one way that you could shift from the deficit-based into a more strengths-based model in your daily practices. Thanks for joining us. Come back soon. See you later, sinners.